I greet the saints in the wonderful name of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen.
It is indeed very beautiful and wonderful to see you once again on this beautiful, wonderful Sabbath that the Lord has made. As the poet in the Bible has said, this is the day that the Lord has made, and we shall rejoice and be glad in it. Amen. We should come into the house of prayer and magnify His name, for the Lord is good, and His endurance, or His faithfulness, or His mercy endureth forever. We should enter His gate with praise giving, for the Lord is good, faithful unto the many generations. Indeed, it is a happy Sabbath, and I am so happy to see you. And it is, I know that we are a little bit short today because one of our members, the Chapisas, I believe they're in Zim currently, but wherever they are, I remember speaking to Elder Chapisa during the week, reminding me of my assignment to this church, and I was telling Elder Chapisa that unless death comes, but I'm going to honor the appointment. So I am happy once again to see you. Let us get into the text so that we do not waste more time. Our text for consideration this Sabbath morning is found in the book of Corinthians. 1 Corinthians chapter 9, we're reading from verse 26. 1 Corinthians chapter 9, it is a New Testament book, one of the many books that Paul had written in his first missionary journey, as we know that Paul was a missionary to the Gentiles, or rather the people who were not Jewish. Okay, it's fine. And so it is a communication between the church and himself. So we are reading from verse 26, 1 Corinthians, and I'm reading it from the New International Version. You will follow in whatever version you are following from. And it says, "Therefore I do not run like a boxer, I do not run like someone running aimlessly. I do not fight like a boxer beating the air. No, I strike a blow to my body and make it my slave, so that after I have preached to others, I myself will not be disqualified for the prize." May the Lord add a blessing to the reading of His word. Amen. Amen. Now, in America, shortly after the Second World War, before I get to the title of this message is Locked and Unloaded. So the Americans, after the Second World War, they trained for a war that never actually took place. Now, as most historians or people who are following history, who are fascinated by these things, now, for 45 years before the Soviet Union fell, the Berlin Wall fell, it was generally known as the Cold War. Now, during that time, Americans, of course, they enlisted into the army. And when they enlisted into the army, they joined young men who were going to college. They dropped out so that they can enlist into the war, because there was this narrative or this belief that America and Russia, they were gearing up for this big war. So you had also in Russia, or at that time it was known as the Soviet Union, they were tanking up, putting up weapons, buying and manufacturing weapons, because they believed that there was this war that was coming, but actually it never came to pass. In fact, for those 45 years, it was the time where there was large espionage which was happening, because Russia believed that America was at war with them, and so Americans also believed that Russia was at war. So in the middle, you had nations which had picked sides to see what would happen. But what's so fascinating about that actually that war never took place. In fact, when you look into the history documents, you will discover that there were many tanks, there were many weapons. In fact, one of the prolific weapons that was manufactured during that period is currently known as the AK-47, that is the Kalashnikov. Now, the AK-47, when it was made, that weapon, when it was manufactured by the guy Kalashnikov, it was a weapon so powerful that when you shoot it, it could penetrate through the wall and still injure whoever you were shooting. In fact, in most countries, the AK-47, it is a gun which is not, it's illegal for any civilians. Even people at war, you are not supposed to have that weapon. But now you can imagine the disappointment that followed after that. The men who had trained for war, who were put into the rigorous training because they were believing that there was a war coming, but the war never actually took place. Now put yourself in their position. Imagine you gave up your youth, you gave up everything to join an army because you believe there's a war coming, only to discover that that war was never coming. And it brings a thought to me that imagine that after all the preaching that has been done, after all the church work has been done, after everything, the sacrifices, I mean, when your friends were living the life, but you chose to come to church, you chose to read your Bible, you chose to believe, but imagine after you've done all of that, after all that has been done, we get a message that actually heaven is not there. Imagine how would you feel knowing that all that you grew up to believe was actually not come to pass. And actually it has also led me to the thought that we as church members, we have developed this idea of making people dispensable and making people temporary, because at some point in the back of our minds we believe that anyway this is not our home, and so I can do away with you because I know there's a heaven. This is why that we are comfortable with enemies. We are comfortable with chasing people out of church, because after all, we know that we don't have to do the hard labor, because eventually we tell ourselves that Jesus is coming, so I don't have to make right with you. Now imagine that you've disposed of people, you've never apologized, you choose regardless of, or you refuse to apologize and make nice with people, only to discover that heaven is actually not coming. And that is why sometimes we come to church, brothers and sisters. We don't come to church so that we can become better Adventists. We don't come to church so that we can become better Christians. We come to church so that we can become better humans. God is not looking for better Adventists. God is not looking for better preachers. God is looking for better humans. People who will be able to navigate life and make life easier for somebody else. And that is why when we worship, we should ask God, God, in spite of all that I'm going through, please make me a better human being. Because when Jesus comes, God is not going to say, oh, you are a better Adventist and therefore enter into my kingdom. No. God is looking for better human beings, because that's what we're looking for. So that is the whole thought that just occupied my mind. Now, coming back to the narrative that I have shown. Also, you know, if you follow the Olympics, there is this gentleman, I'm sure some of you know him. He goes by the name of Usain Bolt. Now, Usain Bolt is one of the most decorated Olympians ever in history. He has so many gold medals, and he's a fantastic sprinter. In fact, I once made an argument after watching the previous Olympics which happened in Japan. And then I said that because at the time, of course, we know that Usain retired. But after looking at the 100-meter sprints that was there, I made a conclusion that if Usain were to come out of retirement and run with those guys, he would still be there. But if you spoke to Usain right now and asked him how did he become such a prolific runner, he will tell you one thing, that he, outside the Olympics, he would spend 4 years sacrificing, spend 4 years living well, 4 years training hard, sleeping well, eating right, giving up a lot of stuff in order to run under 9 seconds. Imagine, all your life, people are doing stuff, but you are busy training. And what you are training for, it has to be achieved under 9 seconds. And all those years for Usain Bolt, as he argued in one of the interviews, that all the hard labor, it only culminated under one moment. And I'm here to share with you this morning, brothers and sisters, that sometimes our lives are usually wrapped up in one moment. One moment can change your life forever. And that is why when we live our life, we should always be mindful that anything that we do will always boil down to one moment. One moment is all that it takes to change your life. And that is why when Paul talks at what he talks about, that all the things that he does it because he knows that life can change in one moment. Your life, you don't have to wait for moments, because God can just use one moment to change your life. In a question in point, when David, with all the training he did, his moment came when he faced Goliath. David, because he had spent so much years training and having a relationship with God, that when Goliath came, he didn't say that I'm not cut up for this, but he took the opportunity, because David understood that sometimes life is all about moments. Now, when we go to this text that we just read, because we have to understand what Paul is talking about in the text that I just read. Now, Paul, as I mentioned before I started, that Paul was a missionary to the Gentiles, people who were not Hebrews. Now, the letter to the Corinthians is a letter speaking to the Greek community, or Greek community, speaking community. Now, this was the church that Paul had visited in one of his first missionary journeys. And of course, if you studied the Bible, you'll know that Paul had a couple of missionary journeys in and around Asia Minor, a bit of Europe, and he died when he was planning to go to Spain. And so when he came to Corinthians, there was one thing that Paul went there and he decided, and he saw in the church of Corinth. It wasn't unlike any other church that Paul had visited, but the church of Corinth was kind of different from the church of Ephesus or the church in Galatians. There was something that was different that it really troubled Paul. That is why when he wrote the book of Corinthians, or rather the letter to the church in Corinthians, it was an engagement between Paul and the elders in Corinthians. And when Paul was writing, whether the first or second Corinthians, you can see in the language that Paul was using that he was trying to address certain issues in the church in Corinth that were bothering him. And so he was not rather being mean to them, but he was sharing this so that they can become better Christians. But above all else, Paul was telling them to fix these problems so that they can become better humans. Now, one of the issues that Paul encountered when he visited the church, and as you can see in the communication, is that the church in Corinth had a lot of things. It's almost like a modern day church. If Paul were alive today and visited any of the churches, be it Adventist or otherwise, then Paul would also come to the same conclusions that he came when he was writing to the church in Corinth. And what were those issues? One of those issues was immorality. He found that this church had a lot of immorality. In fact, if you read the text very well, you'll discover that in the same church, there was a son and a mother engaging in a sexual act. It was an acceptable thing, and there's a reason why those things were accepted, of which I'll come to it later. There was immorality. There was marriage. People didn't also understand what marriage means to the body of Christ. There was celibacy issues which were found in the church in Corinth. And also there were women in worship, but more rather, okay, let me slow down for a bit here. When Paul addresses the women in the church of Corinth, I know for the most part, most of us have used that warning from Paul and applied elsewhere. Are we still together? Now, when Paul goes to Corinth, he sees women worshiping the way they are worshiping and causing havoc and making worship difficult, to the point that Paul says women should not teach at church. Are we familiar with that? Are we still together? When Paul says women should not teach at church. If they have a question, they should go home and ask their husbands. Are we still together? Now, the reason that Paul was saying that, he was not saying that all women in all churches should behave like that. In fact, he was addressing that because there was a background to why women in Corinth were behaving that way. And I'll get to that. So when Paul addresses the women, when he says women should not preach or teach in church, he's not saying all women in all churches should do it like that. But he was saying women in Corinth should not teach or preach because there was a situation there. Alright? And so, also other issues that Paul found in Corinth that troubled him, that was the food offered to the idols. That we as Christians, we should be careful into eating food that is offered to idols. Now, most of us, and especially of the African leanings, you will know that not all our families believe in what we believe. Sometimes you go home and then you find that there is a function, or maybe there's been a funeral and then they are doing something in order to venerate whoever is dead. And sometimes you get invited to these things, and now you have found yourself in a predicament. Do I eat and not eat? And so those were the things that Paul was talking about. And also communion. Paul was also highlighting that in what state we should be whenever we are engaging in the Lord's Supper. And all those things are connected. For instance, you cannot eat food offered to the idols and at the same time, when we are having communion worship, you sit in the Lord's table. Because when you sit and eat the communion service in the Lord's table, you should understand that God has invited you to His table. Which means as we sit in the Lord's Supper and we eat, we wash our feet, we break bread, we drink wine, we are actually saying, Lord, I'm pledging allegiance to you. And since I'm pledging allegiance to you, I will not sit and eat in other tables. Are we still together? So that is why when we eat the communion service, we should be careful in the tables that we eat at. Be careful in the tables which you get invited to. I know that we live in a world where we like to be invited in places, but be very careful because some of the food that you'll be eating is offered to other gods. And then of course Paul also addresses the issue of spiritual gifts. Now Corinth, what made that city very interesting is that it was a diverse coastal city. If you go into the biblical map and see where Corinth was, it was a melting pot of all people. It was near the capital, Athens of Greece. Now it almost is like when you live in, it was Pretoria and Johannesburg. Corinth being Johannesburg. Now as you know, that Pretoria is a little bit chilled, but Joburg is not chilled. Joburg is where you find all types of things under the sun. And so Corinth was like that. It was a melting pot of all people, of all diversity, of all leanings, of all beliefs and all religions. They were all wrapped up in Corinth. And if you have a high diversity of people, you would have habits, because everybody brings their own habits into this one place. And people went to Corinth when they wanted to have fun. It's the same thing when you have people from Newcastle. When he says the weekend is here, I'm going to Joburg. Now, some they are going to Joburg because they have family members in Joburg. But for some, they go to Joburg because they know that Joburg is where it's happening. Joburg is a place of fun. Joburg, I can do whatever with whoever and nobody would care. So Corinth, in that time, it was a place where you go and have fun. And what happens in Corinth stays in Corinth. In fact, they even had almost a term that if you were behaving in such a riotous way, or if full of debauchery, or full of mischief, or full of immorality, people would even tell you that now you are behaving, you are doing a Corinth. When people say you are Corinthianing now, it meant that you are behaving in the worst way. But in spite of all of this is where I love God. In spite of Corinth being the wicked city like Nineveh was, being wicked in everything, but God still sends Paul to go and preach the gospel. Now what does that tell you and me? That we should not judge people based on what we think we know about them. They are still candidates for the heavenly kingdom. And also, in Corinth, what was happening there as well, there were Isthmian games. That is where the modern day Olympics started from, in Corinth. Now, Corinth, once in a blue moon, they would have Isthmian games. Those were the Olympics. They would have sprinting, they would have boxing, they would have wrestling, and people went there to see athletes competing amongst each other. And also, Corinth, as I mentioned, it was a diverse and hostile city. There was a lot of idolatry happening in the city. Now, Corinth was very infamous to having temples dedicated to Zeus, Apollo, Jupiter, Hera. And the statues of these gods were all over the city. I mean, Greeks were very idolatrous people. In fact, the residue of Greek mythology is still even found in this day and age. Go to your nearest Catholic church, and I'm not dissing the Catholics. If you're Catholic, sorry, my mom was a Catholic, so I know what I'm talking about. If you went to a Catholic church and you went inside, what would you find? Statues all over the place. Now, those things, you would think they came from Rome. Yes, also Rome was an idolatrous kingdom, empire, but it also got it from Greece. So Greek mythology, Greek and everything, in fact even today, even Greek mythology is still very much venerated and people still appreciate it. But one of the most famous things that made people want to go to Corinth is that they were worshipping, there was a worship of Aphrodite. That is the goddess of love, beauty, pleasure, patience, and procreation. So when people went to Corinth, in as much as they were having fun with anything else, but they went to Corinth because this religion of Aphrodite, it attracted them in order to come. Now, what kind of religion was happening and why Aphrodite stands out more than Zeus and all other gods? It was because when people went into the temple of Aphrodite, this was the temple where people were having orgies inside the temple. You knew that if I'm a man, I'm going to that church. The only thing I'll be doing in that church, I'll be having sex with whoever and whoever. And it was the women, it was like a brothel, but also a church. It was the women who were running that church. And so men, every time a man had money, the only thing he wants to do is go to Corinth so that he can go and Corinth. And when he gets to Corinth, he will go to a temple of Aphrodite. And when he gets to the temple of Aphrodite, he knows that from the time I get there until I leave or my money runs out, the only thing I'll be doing, I'll just be in that temple being pleasured whichever way I can. Now, so when you have a city that thinks this way, you have a city that behaves this way, and Paul starts a church in a city like that. Now, when Paul starts a church in a city like that, of course, everybody or some people are going to respond to the message of the gospel. Why? Because the gospel, it is a double-edged sword. It is able to get a reaction from people. So even idolaters, when they heard Paul preach, even though there were priestesses in the temple of Aphrodite, but when Paul talked about or told them about the loving Savior, about this power of the gospel, they converted and they went to church. But now, you see, that is when we really need to be careful with in our preaching. And this thing happened. And when I'm saying be careful, I'm just saying that we always need to be mindful and extend grace to the people which we are bringing to the church. Because in as much as those people heard the word, they believed and they joined the church. But the residue of who they were was still with them. Are we still together? I mean, imagine you evangelize a priestess who's conducting a brothel in a church, and she becomes a Christian and believes in this Jesus and still comes to church. In as much as she believes there's a God who created, as Paul was arguing, the unknown God. That, you know, there's a statue of an unknown God, but there's a God who created everything. And then they say, okay, I believe, you know. And as they come to church, now, the residue of who they were, it's still following them to church. And so that is why when Paul, after he comes, a few months later, he comes to Corinth. When they were having worship on the Sabbath, he sees that, man, this is not normal. He sees that people are worshiping, and while the preacher is preaching, you have a woman at the back of the church shouting and behaving in a weird way and undressing and thinking. So to Paul, this was abnormal. This was an abnormal circumstances, because these newly baptized converted members, they were still behaving like they were behaving in the past. And so that is why Paul says women in Corinth should not be teaching in church, because some of them, they are still preaching with the mindset of what they were doing in the temple of Aphrodite. Are we still together? So when Paul says women should not teach and preach in church, he's not saying women of Central should not teach and preach. Because as far as I know, there's nobody worshiping in the temple of Aphrodite. So when Paul was saying, because they were disturbing, they were bringing their ideologies from wherever God got them from to this church. Now, this is when it gets interesting. It is not strange that even though you may become an Adventist, even though you now worship on the Sabbath, even though we see that at least there are traces of change in your life, that once in a while, you will still have traces of where God got you from. Alright? Now, even more recently, I have seen in many churches that now, as Adventists, you know, I love the Adventist church. I was born in this church, I've been in this church all my life, and I don't see myself. I might start my own church. I'm not saying I'm going to, but I might, but I'm still going to be Adventist. It's in the blood, this thing. You know, how they did it, it's like Catholics, it's in the blood. You can't change it. But the Advent message is so peculiar. It is not only just the message, but the singing is so peculiar. That's what makes us different. It does not make us better than, but it makes us different. So that when we are preaching to others, there has to be a difference between a Pentecostal and an Adventist. We are not saying that I'm a better Christian than the other, but how we see things and how we apply things, they are different. Are we still together? But now and again, because there are some people who join the ship, forgetting that, hey, you have to get rid of the things you are coming from. And instead, they bring it here. And now, recently, if you go to many Adventist churches, you would even hardly tell the difference. Am I in an Adventist church or I'm in a Pentecostal church? Because nowadays, people are worshiping, they are doing things. The only thing missing now is that you have people preaching in tongues. But sometimes you don't even see the difference. And that is why, my brothers and sisters, now and again, we need to remind ourselves that why this gospel, why our preaching, our message and mission, why it is so important, because if we lose sight of who we are, we're going to go with any wind that comes. And so when we get to the text, this is when Paul is coming, as he was addressing a couple of things, but when he gets to the text, this is what Paul is using. And Paul is using a sporting language. As I said, there were Isthmian Games or the Olympics, and when Paul was using that language, and Paul uses a lot. In fact, if you read the letters of Paul, he uses a lot of sporting languages, especially to churches in Greek or the Gentiles. He uses that a lot. Because Paul, he knew that he had a responsibility not only to make the gospel logical, reasonable, so that you can understand, but Paul understood that his responsibility as an educated man was not just to preach something that is complicated to people that they can't understand, but that he has to make the gospel tangible to people. And that is why even as preachers today, we should always know that we carry a responsibility to make the gospel tangible. We are not putting things in order to make the gospel nicer. We are just making it tangible so that the person who's listening to the message understands what we are talking about. And so when Paul uses that language, he uses a sporting language in order to bring a certain truth into reality. So Paul starts and he says, I do not run as one without an aim. So Paul is saying that when I run, I'm not a person who's running aimlessly. And what was Paul trying to say here, my brothers and sisters? He was simply saying that this life that we are living, it is what we normally should understand, that life is interlinked with faith. That this life that you are living, you do not have different lives, that you shouldn't have a work life, you shouldn't have a home life, you shouldn't have a social life, and have sometimes you live in a time where you find people that have 4 lives. You don't even know who they are. At church they are one thing, at work they are one thing, with their friends they are the other, and then there's another life that they are living. So when Paul says, I'm not one who's running aimlessly, but Paul was saying, I am the same thing. You will find me at home, I'll still be the same, just like you find me at church. Because my walk in life, the life that I'm living, is connected to my faith. I do not walk by sight, but I walk by faith. Are we still together? That every time we are walking or running, we should understand that we cannot be divorced with everyday life. The problem sometimes we have is that we tend to divorce our spiritual life with our social lives. And that is why it becomes difficult for us to preach to our colleagues, because when you go to work, you are a person with a filthy mouth, but on Sabbath, you come to church and tell us about the Jesus who's coming, but on Sunday and Monday, you live like a demon. Are we still together? So when Paul was saying, I'm not the one, he compares to such a living like somebody who's running aimlessly. Now, for some of you who've done sports at school, you would understand, and Paul, as he was using the analogy of running. Now, one of the things you should understand in running, whether you're a marathon runner, a sprinter, that in order for you to perform at your optimum level, you need to spend time, energy, resources that you have, putting it into this lifestyle so that whenever you run, you know that I have a goal and I have a purpose and I'm going to achieve it. Now, if you are a marathon runner, I know we have a marathon that is coming on, there's a lockdown on Monday, right? Alright, so a shutdown. So on Tuesday, on the holiday, we have a marathon. Now, for the whole month of March, and this is just a personal experience that I'm sharing with you. Now the whole month of March, because I knew there was a marathon happening on the 21st of March. And that marathon is so important because I have to finish the 42 kilometers in under 4 hours, 50 minutes. And in order for me to do that, I haven't qualified yet. I have to qualify and run a marathon, 42 kilometers in 4 hours, 50 minutes. So that it qualifies me for the Comrades Marathon, which is happening in June. We all know about the Comrades Marathon, where crazy people run for 90 minutes under 12 hours. So now I'm also thinking I'm crazy enough to do that. So, but for me to get there, I have a 42 kilometer that I have to run in 4 hours, 50 minutes. It might seem impossible, but actually it's very much possible. Because for the past couple of weeks, I've had a training schedule, I've been running, I've been trying to stay away from sugar, which I love, especially the chocolate. I had to stay away from bread sometimes. I had to eat a lot of veggies and sleep early, drink my water, so that on Tuesday, when the gun goes off, I know that I've trained enough so that once the clock says 4 hours, 50 minutes, I'm already there. because I have spent so much time, resources, in order for me to attain that goal. And it doesn't end there. And once I qualify, I also have to even go even harder so that I prepare for the Comrades Marathon. Are we still together? So when Paul uses that language, he's saying your spiritual life, it is not about what you have done. You should have targets, purpose, run with an aim, knowing full well that once you achieve that aim, you keep on pressing to another goal. And when you run your spiritual life, you do not look at others. I think I've once testified here that with the biggest thing you can do as an athlete or a marathon runner is that when you are running a marathon, instead of focusing on your own race, you are busy looking at other people. But in order for you to achieve the objectives of which you have set yourself, because all of us are running a different marathon, are we still together? All of us are in a different race. We might be here at the same time, but all of us have different missions that we have to achieve. Now, in order for you to achieve that mission, you have to pay attention to you. Are we still together? You need to pay attention to you. You need to watch your spiritual life, your prayer life, your Bible reading life. You cannot be claiming to be a Christian and the only thing you are doing, you are focusing on other people. You will never get there. You know, I have come to this certain conclusion that the people who are not going to make it to heaven is not the people who do not know Jesus. Are we still together? The people who are not going to make it to or have eternal life, it's not going to be people who do not know Jesus. Because Jesus, when Paul argues in Romans chapter 1, that the light of God was shared with everyone. So there's nobody who can claim when Jesus comes back and they'll make an argument and say, but Jesus, I didn't know you. You know, why you are being unfair. Because Jesus has said that his light, his wisdom, who he is, he has shared it with everybody. There's nobody walking, even in an unentered territory. God had communicated with those people there. So the people who are not going to make it to heaven, it's not going to be people who do not know Jesus. In fact, I would even go further and say, some of the people who are not going to make it to eternal life, you will be Adventist. You would ask, Mfundis, you are judging us. Why? Let me put it this way. Because there are some Adventists who are entrenched in busy monitoring other people, that they are forgetting to run their own race. You are busy using standards and scales in order for you to be watching where you are going. Some people are forgetting to have a relationship with Jesus. Instead, they are busy monitoring who's doing what, who's doing this, who did that, who did this. Let's convene a board meeting. Let's talk about this thing. And yet, the person who's monitoring other people, they don't even have one soul that they brought to church. So when Paul says, my spiritual walk, it is my personal business. It is not a clique. I'm not walking with a crew here. This is not a group project, but it's mine. I am taking responsibility, and I think it's about time, my brothers and sisters, that if we are locked into something, let us make sure we are loaded, so that you know that your target is hit. You know, when I was in high school, I was in this class. It was, you know, in high school how they do it. You have I was in grade 10A, 11A and 12A. I was in that A class. Not that I was a genius. Of course, our classmates, they were genius. I just found myself in that class because I was doing certain subjects that were not done in the general courses. We understand general courses. So the subjects that I was doing was math, physics, biology, computer studies, including the languages, which is Afrikaans and English. That was there. Now I don't know what they're doing. There's a lot of things that are happening there. So, and then you had, that was the A class and the B class. We did almost the same subjects. Not that we're genius, but some of them, they got A's. We were just part, you know. We were just part of it. Now, you had the C and D class. Those guys were doing general subjects. That was your geography, your history, Yeah, the general subjects, you know. And actually, the general subjects, that was sometimes was the prelude to some who were doing law. You know, you needed to do your history and everything. Yeah, they did the general classes. Some they did biology, and some did woodwork, and they did all of the stuff. So there was a general class. Now, if you compare the two groups of the A, B, and the C and D, obviously you discovered that the people in C and D were in, their marks were good, but they were not compared to the A and B. And in the C and D class, you found that there was a lot of noise. Most teachers didn't want to go to those classes because it was rowdy. Some of those guys were older than the rest of us. You find that a 21-year-old is still doing grade 10. It was that type of stuff. So even teachers, if you're a teacher, you know that teaching a class with a very old person is a very difficult thing. And so the A and B, we were a bit younger. We were within our, what is expected for you to be in grade 10, 11, and 12. But in my class, it was a special class, super special, because our noise levels, they were higher than the C and D class. In fact, in comparison, we were the most naughtiest bunch compared to C and D. Like, in fact, one teacher even said, we from grade 10 to 11 and 12, we had 3 class teachers, all quit on us. They said, I just cannot handle this class. It's just too much. And we are supposed to be the example of the school, but we were just rebels without a cause. And so in my class, I had a friend who was my seatmate. And he was a brilliant guy. There are these people who are brilliant naturally. They just, teachers they loved his brain, but they didn't like him because he was just brilliant. All of us, they were like that. They were like that with all of us. And I used to sit with him. He was brilliant. In fact, if he did an assignment, you wanted his assignment because you knew he would get an A. You wanted to sit next to him in a test so that when it gets tough, you can just make sure that the answers are correct. You're not cheating. You're just making sure. And it was like that. So I remember one time as we were after school, in our matric year, and now we are big boys of the school. And he said something that has stayed with me to this day. He said, listen, always remember that on the final exam, I'm not going to be there. It's just going to be you and the paper. So make sure that in spite of all the naughtiness we get up to, you go home, you study. Because when the paper comes, it's just going to be you and the paper. Nobody else. The examination is just going to be you and the paper. When you get home, forget that we are a rowdy class. Get home, do your studies. In that way, when the marks are tallied, you'll be found in the paper. In those days, when the matric results came, it wasn't, I don't know now how it's done. Matric results in 2002, when I did my matric, you only came out in the paper. So on the 27th of December, you didn't sleep. It will be Christmas, Boxing Day, and then there will be the 27th. That was Judgment Day. And you knew, then we didn't really have cell phones, they were there, but you needed to go to the store, buy a paper, and the only thing you first saw was your name and your exam number. If your name was not there, you knew you didn't make it. And so I remembered that. And studying and everything, by the grace of God, I made my matric. My name was there. When the names were called up yonder, I was there. So what I'm saying to you, my brothers and sisters, when Paul says, I do not run aimlessly, he says, just like an exam, your spiritual life, it's your responsibility. It's not a group project. We are all here on Sabbath. But if I were to ask each and every one of you what's your purpose in your spiritual walk, it is different. And God gave it for a purpose, so that you mind your spiritual walk. Don't do things because your group of friends or your clique at church, this is what they're doing. If they are busy abusing someone else, don't be found there. Because when the name is called up Ayanda, God is not going to ask, so you and your group of friends, what did you do? God, as He's judging you. So make sure that your spiritual walk, your worship, anything, even it happens at church, it does not derail you from church. Because the exam, when it comes, it's going to come for you. And run and stop competing with others. Be an athlete, a disciplined athlete. Don't compete with me. You may think you're competing with me. You know, there's this thing in church where we like competing with people. Oh, you think you can preach better than this one. Don't compete. Those things don't matter. What matters is when your name is called up yonder, is yours going to be there? And so Paul continues. He says, I am not the one who boxes like you are beating the air. Now, if you are a fan of boxing, you will know that when boxers, when they're training, they do a lot of shadow boxing. They get into the ring and then they spar with someone else. They get their techniques right. They do that. Now, they do that outside the official match. They'll punch a punching bag, a speed ball, they'll run, they'll do a lot of those. That is what they do outside the boxing ring. But when they get into the ring, when a boxer gets into the ring, now that is when the exam is facing you, because you are facing another man or a woman, depending on your lineage. And the prolific boxer is the one when he gets into the ring, he doesn't do the flash and moving with the legs. He just gets to business and he knows the opponent and he will beat them down. So when Paul is saying with your spiritual life, is that have a mission. Don't just spend time preparing and when the test comes, you are failing. Be a boxer that when the test of life comes, you are not busy crying all over the place that please pray for me. Yes, we'll pray for you. But we don't want to pray for you if you're not praying for yourself. I have this clip that I shared the other day. It's T.D. Jakes. It's a funny clip, but he says he doesn't want people praying for him, being prayed for by people whom he doesn't like or they don't like him. Because if you don't like me, how are you going to pray for me? Because if I'm praying for you, my sister, I have to like you. Because if I'm pleading to God about you, I have to say, God, what you've promised in Jeremiah 29 verse 11, please give it to her. But if I don't like you, what is it that I'm praying for? In fact, I'm busy witchcrafting you. Because I won't be praying for your goodwill. I'm praying for evil. That, you know, there are people who pray like that. That, Lord, you are watching that one. That one, I hope you are watching. So that's what T.D. Jakes is saying. He said, if you don't like me, don't pray for me. I'll pray for myself. So it's the same thing with boxing. There will be times where the test of life comes. And Paul says when the test of life comes, it's like being in the boxing ring with an opponent. There will be a time where Satan tests you, where Satan will specifically make you his project. And when that happens, you need to have enough in the tank. Having prayed enough, having read enough, having the spiritual stamina, so that when the devil strikes a blow, he doesn't just knock you with a TKO, but he knocks you down, but you get up because you know you've trained. And so, our mission is to be intentional. We should have a target so that our humanity strikes a blow and becomes a better evangelist. And as I'm coming to an end, Paul says, there's this term that he uses in verse 27. He says, I do not run aimlessly. I do not fight like a boxer who's beating the air. He says, no, I strike a blow to my body and make it my slave, so that after I have preached to others, I myself will not be disqualified from Christ. Remember I said that the people who will not make it to heaven is not the people who do not know Jesus. It will be those who know Jesus, but they will not make it because they are busy watching other things else. So when Paul says, he uses a term, there's a term there. In the King James Version, it says, I keep under my body. Now, that term is a boxing technical term. It says, I strike a blow. Paul says, I'm not striking at someone else. My target is not locked and loaded to someone else. He says, the person I'm competing with, I'm not competing with my brother, I'm not competing with my sister, I'm not competing with anyone. But when Paul says, I keep under my body, that I strike a blow to my body, he says, the target faces me. He says, I am self-disciplined, that my body, I make sure that I subject my body. Now, if you've been in a fight, a physical fight, you know that the one who strikes a knockout blow, he's won the fight. That you can never, there's a term in isiZulu, it says, where if men are fighting, if the other one beats the other one, and the fight is done, it should be it. But then they say, no, a fight amongst men never ends. You might have beaten me today, but a few months I would have trained, I would be stronger, now I'll attack you and ambush you. Now, even when you see the person who's beating you up, you will always be subjected to that person because you know he's beating you up. So when Paul says, I keep under my body, he's literally saying that my body, I strike a knockout punch to myself, to my body, bring myself as a slave to me under my control, so that after I've preached to others, I myself am not a castaway. So what Paul is trying to say, he says that you will never achieve anything without self-discipline. Some of the things that are lacking in our church life or life in general is that we have people with no self-discipline. You will know how frustrating it is, especially women, if you work with a male with no self-discipline that is busy passing sexual remarks every time. He sees a woman passing by, he's passing a remark. You don't even want to be next to that person because you know that this guy is chasing after any skirt you see. In fact, you will never even marry someone without a self-discipline because you will know that this one, I can't even live alone with my own mother because he has no self-discipline. Anything that walks, he will try and get to bed. So when Paul says, I keep under my body, I have self-discipline so that if I am disciplined, I will be able to achieve my objectives. Because if you do not have self-discipline, if you don't have principles, it will be difficult to do anything. When we were growing up in Newcastle, near the engine garage here, in Allen Street, near Potter, there will be the engine's garage. Now there will be street wire, and then there will be this place. Now I think they're selling vegetables. I don't know what they're selling, but it's a shop near engine garage. Now, back then in the 90s, I think it stopped around 2001, 2002. Now, in that place, there used to be an arcade place where, as a young man from school, you come from Newcastle Senior, you knew that your pocket money you saved, put it in your pocket so that you go and play games. Now, our parents, my mother hated that the most, including my dad, because they thought it was the slots machine, the gambling one. So when they saw that, when we went there, they thought we were gambling, but we were just playing games, because at the time we didn't have TV games, then it was TV games, and then it became Sega, PlayStation, and so forth. So that was our form of entertainment. We'll go there and play arcade. Play your Street Fighters and whatever games you play. So in that arcade, there used to be a machine which was called the jukebox. Again, the young ones will never know what the jukebox is, but the old ones, they know. The jukebox is almost a karaoke machine, but the jukebox is where you put money, you chose a track, and then you play that track, whichever track, and most of it was the golden oldies. Whatever song you wanted, you press that button, and then it will play. So while you're playing games, you play a jukebox, and it was like that. Now, a jukebox function, it never played on its own. When there was no money, it stopped playing. You put money, and then it started playing. And hence it gave to the term, Fagimadu Zobon, that if you put money, you'll see me sing. If there's no money, then there's no singing. And so, if you don't have self-discipline, you are like a jukebox. On your own, you are nothing until somebody controls you. Because if you don't have self-discipline, you become a gun for hire. You know, here in KZN, we have a problem of hitmen in Ghana. We're all familiar with Inkabi. We saw what one of the Nkabis did a couple of weeks ago in Durban, killed in AKA. Now, the thing is, when you talk to Inkabi, the hitmen, there's interviews that you can go on YouTube and see how they behave. Inkabi, they are gun for hire. It's people with no principles. You just come to you, I give you $10,000 or 10,000 rands and say, please, go kill Mfundisi Mbatha. You're not even going to ask, what has he done? Can't you sit it out? Can't you talk it out? You know, as soon as you get that money, you are killing. And on top of it, once you are caught, you're not even going to have loyalty to the person who paid you. You are going to sin and say, no, the one who, I didn't kill him, I don't have a problem with him. This guy paid me to kill this person. Now, in churches, we have jukeboxes or inka, people without self-discipline, who are willing to do anything because somebody's paying them or because they want to be loved and validated. So when Paul says, I keep under my body, he says, I am going to discipline myself. I am going to make sure that I am content. And that is why he writes in Philippians, I know what it is to be without, and I know what it is to have plenty. And in all those things I've learned to be content, because I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength. So what does that mean to your self-discipline? That if you don't have something, be content living without it. And in the right time, God will make a plan for you to have it. Don't go and be a gun for hire. Because if you have a gun for hire, you have no principles. Because people without discipline, they have no principles. People without principles, they cannot stand. People who cannot stand, they have no peace. That is why you have church members up and down causing havoc at church because they don't have self-discipline. So when Paul says, I'm not like a runner who's running without an aim. I am disciplined enough. I know what's in my weapon. I know what my target is. When I get into the ring, I don't just shadow box and try and flash that I've got a six-pack, I've got this. He says, no. The only thing when I get into the ring, my opponent knows that I'm serious because I look at him in the eye and I strike and knock a blow. But above all else, this is what Paul says. He says, I discipline myself. Because if I don't discipline myself, I'll be a reference point. Imagine, for all eternity, after all this, I've preached so many times. We make it to heaven. Jesus comes. We all transformed. People are raised from the grave. We all go to heaven. And then when you are looking around, you say, hey, Fundis used to come and preach to us at Central. I don't see him. You know, I see somebody looking like him, hey, but I don't see him. And then you go to Jesus and say, Jesus, yeah, I've seen all my relatives. I've seen everybody. But there's this Fundis I don't see. You know, I thought he preached well, but I don't see him. Where is he? And then he gives you a reel. You know, in Facebook, in Instagram, there's a reel where he does all the cut-ups of your life, where people do a photo dump. They say, this is a March photo dump. So God will give you a earthly dump, where he shows, he says, oh, yeah, he preached. He did all the good things, but he didn't have self-discipline. Because after he preached to others, he forgot to preach to himself. And that's why he's not here. So my brothers and sisters, as I end, I'm going to say one thing. Paul says, let us not be Christians who run without an aim. Let us not be boxers who keep on punching the aim. He says, let us be disciplined. Let us subject our bodies. Let us not be jukeboxes. Let us not be people gun for hire. But let us have principles that you would rather stand or rather not stand at all. Ellen White writes in, I'm sure we all know the famous quote, I think it's in Education. She says, the greatest want of this world is the want of men and women who will stand for the truth, men who will not be bought or sold, men whose conscience is clear as the needle to the pole, men who will stand for the right though heavens may fall. That is what God is looking for. God is not looking for better Adventists. He can convert the whole world over. He's not looking for that. What God is looking for a better human. Somebody who can stand. He says, I'd rather have Jesus. There's a song. I'd rather have Jesus than anything. He's not saying you are not ambitious enough. You are ambitious. But the song says, I'd rather have Jesus. I'd rather have him validate me than the validation of the world. Because when the rod is called up yonder, ask yourself, is my name going to be there? May God bless us all. Amen.